Welcome back to Nana Bell's Bible Stories. We have a story today, but first I just wanted to say I didn't post a video yesterday because I had to take my dad to the doctor. He's an elderly, almost 89-year-old man, and I take care of him. I do everything he needs me to do to make sure he's okay. And I took him to the doctor yesterday, so I didn't get a video out. It's my goal to get at least one video out a week as I work full time. I work in financial services doing loans. And so I have lots to do during the week and after work every day. And I'm going to try to do this once a week on Saturdays. However, yesterday I had an appointment, but it is Sunday today and I'm going to get the video out and hopefully you guys will enjoy this one. This is a story about Abram's wife Sarah, and she had an idea. This story today is not as action-packed as some of the ones with the wars and the different activities that Abram was doing. It's more of a talking video, and so I'm going to be sharing some concepts behind what God thinks about several things like marriage and slavery. And I will be talking a little bit this week. And that's actually okay. That's good for you if you are a young person, trying to understand what God thinks about things and how the world works. Just listen up. So I'll get started with the video. It's in Genesis chapter 16. And we're talking about Abram again. Here he is, and here's his wife Sarai, although she's looking a little older now. Abram is now 85 years old, and Sarai is 10 years younger than him. So she's 75 years old. And Abram and Sarai are in the town of Hebron. That's where they were living and did live for quite a while. They had not received that promised baby that they were looking forward to, because God told them many years ago, 10 years ago in fact, that Abram was going to be blessed with a baby and that he was going to have many, many descendants like the sands of the sea and the stars of the sky, if you remember in previous videos. And so they're still not parents. And so they're wondering about this, and Sarah is trying to figure out what is going on. Sometimes God does take a while before he fulfills his promises, and it's because he wants to see if we'll remain faithful to him despite maybe not seeing them, that we'll believe for them. And so that's what Abraham was doing, and Sarah was trying to. But this is what happened. Sarai had an Egyptian maid that she'd gotten when they went to Egypt many years ago, if you remember. Sarai had a maid named Hagar, and this is Hagar over here. Now, she was Sarai's maid. That means she took care of everything for her, like took care of the washing and the cooking and all that. She was a servant and maybe even a slave. She might have been paid, but it said that she was her maidservant. But back then people did have slaves, and even now people have slaves. Here in America, we don't have slaves. We did for the first little bit of our nation's history, but God does not. He believes that every man is made in his image and every man should be free. That's God's prime view on that. However, back in the day, they did have slaves, and Hagar was Sarai's maidservant slave. Now, when somebody was their slave, that means that they were their possession, just like a chair or a table or my house is my possession. Their slave was their possession. That meant that they could do whatever they wanted to with the slave. They could beat them. Although slaves don't work very good if you beat them and don't feed them. So many masters were good to their slaves. Many masters did take care of their slaves. And so, Sarah, I'm sure, took care of Hagar, and Hagar took care of Sarai. But Sarai got this idea in her head. She was thinking, well, maybe it was just God telling Abram, my husband, that he would have lots of descendants. And maybe it wasn't through me. Maybe that God meant for Abram to have many descendants. So she got this wild idea in her head. And I'm saying wild because it was not a good one. Not a good idea. But she came up to Abram one day and she said to him, she said, maybe what God meant is that you would have many descendants. So I'm going to give you Hagar, my maid, as a wife. Because Sarah could do that because, of course, Hagar is her possession. And so she gave Abram Hagar as a wife. And Abram didn't say anything. He was like, okay. And back then, actually, many men had several wives. Back in the Old Testament, that was kind of a culture's, their culture. And there's several reasons for that. Because first of all, there weren't many men because of wars, maybe lots of wars. And so the men on the battlefield would die, and there would be way more women than there were men. And so each man would take several wives to take care of, because back then the wives didn't work. Now I work. In the modern world, women do work. But back then, and even in the early days of our history in the America here, women didn't work until like the 1960s or so. So men would take care of women, and women looked up to men to be the people, the person that would take, that would shelter them and feed them and take care of them. And so many men took several wives because there weren't enough men to go around, perhaps. Also, for reproductive purposes, there weren't a lot of people. That means having babies. There weren't a lot of people in the world at that time. So in order to populate the cities and have workers to work on their farms and to work the fields and do the agriculture, plant the seeds and harvest like the wheat or whatever they had growing, or keep the sheep out in the fields, they would have to have a lot of kids to be able to do those kinds of things. And that was important to have many children. So men would take several wives in order to have the workers to do that kind of thing for their estate. And lots of times men took several wives and had lots of children for the status too, because if a man had many wives, that meant that he could afford to provide. And so he was looked on with respect by other men who couldn't maybe afford to have so many wives. So there's lots of reasons cultures do that. Even there's some cultures like in Africa today, or other nations that have that practice that men do have several wives, or maybe a couple. But in Christian-based cultures like we have here in America, in Christianity, men are encouraged to have only one wife in the Bible. And why is that? Why is that? Because many reasons. In Genesis 2:24, we see Adam. He's the first man that was made by God. And he had a rib taken out. I haven't told this story yet, but he had a rib taken out of his body by God, and God fashioned a woman out of the rib for man. So Eve became the first woman, and she was made from man. And now you look at that story and you go, well, God didn't make 3 women for Adam. He just made one. And then later in the scriptures, it says, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. The two, a man and a woman, shall become one. And so they become one person as a married couple. And that's in later in the scriptures. And so why is that? Because humans really can't have true intimacy. That means true fellowship, true open relationship. I mean, like as in you feel you feel like you can trust the other person. You feel like you can share all your secrets with the other person. Can't really have true intimacy with more than one person. And that's just how humans are made. And why is that? It's because there's jealousy and competitiveness that comes in if you have more than one that you're trying to have a relationship with. But a man and a woman together, that's God's perfect plan. And so we see later too in the Bible some other stories where the jealousy and the competitiveness came in to the marriage situation when a man had more than one wife. So we will talk about those later. My husband and I have been married for 37 years, and we've been faithful to each other for those 37 years. And it's not always been easy. It's we've had some challenging times, and we've argued quite a lot. And I used to have a really bad temper, and my husband, he put up with me. And my husband, he's always been a really good man. And good men don't hit their wives, and good men don't lie to their wives, and good men think about their wives before they think about themselves. In 1 Timothy 3:2, it says in the New Testament, it says that leaders in the church, like a Christian church, and this is one of the things why we believe in a man should be married to only one woman, and it's a man and a woman together that makes a marriage. Leaders in the church should be the husband of only one wife. And so that's one of the requirements for one of the elders of the church. That's one of God's instructions. So marriage equals one man and one woman. So God usually gives commands that are hard, and it might be hard to stay with the same woman for the rest of your life, or stay with the same man for the rest of your life, especially if you argue and you have differences. And God wants us to be yoked. That means put together, like two oxen are yoked together. He wants us to be yoked with someone that is another believer in Jesus. And so that way we can have at least the same values and the same vision, the same goals of pleasing the Lord together. Because if one does not have that same vision and another does, it makes it very hard. So my husband and I at least have that. We both came together as a married couple in the very beginning in 1987 as believers. And so that helped us throughout the way. So God, though, I was going to say, God usually gives commands that are hard because he wants to see who will be faithful to obey him and his commandments, no matter what. So anyway, let's go back to this. Let's go back to Abram and Sarai. Now, Sarai is saying, Abram, I'm going to give you Hagar as my wife. And Abram went along with it. And just because he did doesn't mean that this is okay. This, the people in the Old Testament, even though they called him prophets, and he was a prophet of God and a friend of God, that doesn't mean that Abram did everything perfect. And you and me, we don't do everything perfect either, but that doesn't mean that our heart is bad. That means that we're trying, but maybe we fail. And then all we have to do is the Lord will make it good if we confess to him that, yes, I didn't do the right thing there, but God, can you help me make it good again? And so, but anyway, Abram, he went along. He didn't even ask God about this. He just went along with his wife because it sounded good to him. I mean, okay, I'll have another wife. But if God knew that Abram was married to Sarai, and Sarai was his favorite woman in the whole world, and she was. Abram loved Sarai so very much. And if God knew that Abram was married to Sarai, and they were one person, then he probably meant that Sarai would be the mother of the promised child, because the promise was for both of them. So Abram should have realized that. But Abram listened to the voice of his wife. And it's good for men to listen to the voice of their wives. It is. It's good for women to be able to give advice to their husband and their husband listen. And men should do that. But it's not good to forget God's promise to them together and leave Sarai out. It wasn't just Abram that God was concerned about. It was them as a couple. So Abram went to Hagar's house, as she was now his wife, and Hagar became pregnant with his baby. And that's when the trouble started. Hagar then became proud, and she thought she kind of forgot her place. Because Sarai was still her master. But she became proud and she started mocking Sarai because Hagar could get pregnant and Sarai couldn't. And that is something that most women really want. Most women do want to be mothers and have children. And it grieved Sarai very much that she hadn't had a child. And so this hurt her heart very, very much when Hagar started mocking her and making fun of her and treating her badly. And so Sarai went to Abram again and complained and said, she is just being terrible, and she's doing things that she's saying things that hurt my heart. And Abram said to her, because he loved Sarai, and he didn't really love Hagar, he loved Sarai. Abram said, do to Hagar what you want. She is still your servant. And so Sarai treated Hagar very harshly. Let's take Abram out here. And she started treating Hagar very harshly. And Hagar couldn't handle it. I don't know what happened between them. It didn't say in the verse. But Hagar fled from the presence of her mistress. And so she went off to the desert. So here's Hagar out in the desert. And she's just now run away from her whole support system, her whole life. She's run away from her mistress because Sarai was being mean to her. And here she is out in the desert, and there's no food, there's no shelter out here in the desert, but she did find a spring of water. And so here she is near the spring of water, and she doesn't know what she's going to do. She doesn't know what comes next, and she's a little desperate. And so there is something that happens. The angel of the Lord comes and talks to her. And now we talked a few weeks ago about the word of the Lord being Jesus in the Old Testament, when the Bible talks about the word of the Lord came to them, because Jesus is called the Word in John 1:1. And now he's being called the angel of the Lord, and we'll see that it is definitely Jesus later, because she calls him Lord. And we don't call angels Lord, because angels are just messengers of God. They are not gods themselves. They are created by God. So this is the angel of the Lord. It's Jesus in physical form, and we know that Jesus is God in physical form. God the Father, no man can see him and live. But Jesus does appear to people in the Old Testament in human form, because he is God, and he doesn't live inside of time. He can go to and fro throughout time because he's God. So the angel of the Lord came and said to her, it says in Genesis 16, Hagar, Sarai's maid, where are you going? And she responded and said, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress. And the angel of the Lord said, return to your mistress and submit to her authority. Now, we talked about earlier that God doesn't really like slavery. That's not his plan. He does not believe that any person should be a slave, because all should be free, and they find their freedom in Jesus, of course. But slavery is not God's plan. But in the Old Testament, he did allow the concept of slavery to teach us the difference between living a life of bondage and living a life of freedom. Because if we live a life of sin, we are in bondage. And so it makes an analogy later in the Bible between slavery and a life of sin. And so he's saying to her, listen, you need to go back and submit to your mistress. 1 Corinthians 7:21 says, when we're coming to know God as believers, it says in that chapter, it says, if you are a slave, remain a slave. Don't try to be free, but serve your master. It says, were you a slave? Do not worry. But if you can obtain your freedom, then do so. For the one who was a slave when called to faith, the Lord is the Lord's free person, because inside you're free. And it says if you are a free person when you become a believer, you are now Christ's slave. We're his bondservant. We do what he instructs and we obey everything he says. So we, as a free person, because I'm not a slave, I'm a free person, but we obey God because he is God. And we fear him, not in an unholy way, but in a holy way. We have great reverence and respect for God. So we are his slave, his bondservants is another word of putting it. And you know that when you go to work, like when I go to work at the financial institution I work at, I'm not just free to do anything I want to do. I have to get there right on time, and I can't leave early. I have to do my work as my boss wants me to do. And I can't just decide that I'm going to do something outside of their plan. I have to follow the plan that they've made. So I'm not a slave, but we all have to do some things that are necessary in order to live life. And so it says in the word, it says, whatever you do, do heartily as unto the Lord. So do it for God. You're not doing it. I'm not doing it for my boss. I'm doing it for God. I'm actually wanting to please him with the good job that I'm doing. I do my work with passion. I do my work with accuracy and excellence so that God is honored. I try to anyway. But anyway, so we all have to do some things. And so Jesus was, the word angel of the Lord was telling Hagar, you need to just go do this. Mostly because he knew what would happen if she stayed out there in the desert. Wild animals would eat her. She wouldn't have any food and she'd starve to death. I mean, on the other hand, what's the other option? She needed to go back to her support system. And he knew that, and she knew that. So she did. She decided to do that. But Jesus had one more thing to say to her. He said, however, the Lord said, I will greatly multiply your descendants so that they will be too many to count as well. He said, behold, you are with child, and you will have a son, and you will call his name Ishmael, which means God hears. So God heard her cry. God heard her predicament, her troubles. Because the Lord Jesus went on, because the Lord has taken heed of your affliction, he will be though a wild donkey of a man, and his hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him, and he will live to the east of all his brothers. Now God knows each person before they are born. He knew who Ishmael would be in the future, and he knew who his descendants would be in the future. And in the future, Ishmael's descendants do not get along with the descendants of the promised son through Sarai. But that's another story. But Hagar called on the name of the Lord who spoke to her. She called him El Roi, which means you are a God who sees me. God sees us. And then she was very astonished and said, how have I even remained alive after seeing him? Because we know that if we see God the Father, no man can see him and live, because we have sin and he is holy. But Jesus, she saw Jesus and she was amazed. She said, how could I have even seen God and remained alive? So Hagar bore Abram a son 9 months later, and Abram was 86 when Ishmael was born. And this is 14 years still until the promised son through Sarai was going to be born. And we have a couple more stories before that. But we have this story today was about Sarai and about Hagar. And Hagar was the symbol of slavery. In the New Testament, it talks about Hagar was the bondwoman. In other words, she was in bonds. She was a slave. She was a servant. And Sarai was the free woman. She was not a slave. She was the promised wife. And it talks about in Hebrews 4:22 through 24, it says, "For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by the slave and one by the free woman, one according to the flesh." That means it was Abram that decided to have the baby with Hagar. And he didn't take God into account, didn't ask God. He just did what he wanted. And so that's walking in the flesh. And so Abram walked in the flesh and reaped the consequences of it. Although Ishmael, he loved Ishmael. And Ishmael went on to have many, many descendants. There was trouble in the house, as we saw today in the story. But he also, the scripture in Hebrews said there was one according to the Spirit, the promise, and that was God's promise. So that's the story of a little bit of jealousy, a little bit of competitiveness, a little bit of heartache and challenging relationships. But God will make the relationships good, and he will make things good if you obey and live by his principles. So I hope you enjoyed that story. Nanabelle loves you, and Jesus loves you more, and he wants you to have a relationship with him so that you can grow wise and do great and marvelous things in this wonderful world he created.